For years, whispers floated through palace halls, rumors that Queen Elizabeth II had quietly chosen her true successor long before her passing. Not Charles, not Camilla, but Catherine. Many dismissed it as fantasy. But when Prince Edward emerged from the shadows holding a sealed royal codex labelled Appendix Windsor IV, everything changed. The question now isn't whether it was true, but how far the crown went to bury it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as a low murmur among archivists quickly turned into unease when unusual movements were detected within the deepest layers of royal record storage. Documents logged as untouched for decades suddenly showed access codes triggered in the dead of night. Inventories no longer aligned. Boxes once accounted for appeared to vanish from official ledgers, and the silence surrounding those changes felt calculated. Even more unsettling was the sudden disappearance of several clerks who had served directly under Queen Elizabeth during the final phase of her reign, veterans of ritual, record, and royal memory, gone without a word. Then came the forgotten reference from a 1986 internal memorandum, just a line, almost invisible to the untrained eye, mentioning Appendix Windsor IV as a personal constitutional contingency. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. As the palace reeled inward, fragments from Catherine's past resurfaced in a new light. The rare, unguarded moments between her and Elizabeth, once dismissed as warmth, mentorship, generosity, now appeared charged with something deeper, almost instructional. Conversations that lingered longer than protocol allowed. Questions that no one else was ever asked. Subtle tests of resolve, restraint, and instinct that Catherine passed without realizing she was being measured against history itself. And as these moments reassembled into a pattern too consistent to ignore, resistance began to form just as quietly. Camilla's inner circle moved swiftly, not openly, but with pressure applied through back channels, advisory boards, and legal buffers designed to discourage inquiry before it ever reached daylight. The tension spread fast, not with shouting, but with quiet door closings and delayed approvals. Suddenly, Edward found his requests stalled. Invitations rescinded, long-standing privileges called into question. Yet instead of retreating, he advanced. In one decisive move that stunned even his closest confidants, Edward formally initiated an emergency session of the Royal Historical Review Committee, invoking a dormant clause reserved only for matters of constitutional threat. It was a declaration that whatever Appendix Windsor IV contained was no longer a private matter of memory, but a direct challenge to the narrative of succession itself. The palace did not erupt, it held its breath, because everyone knew that once hidden archives are summoned into light, they no longer belong to those who buried them. But this was no ordinary document. Appendix Windsor IV would unlock a vault sealed with a monarch's own cipher, and what lay inside would fracture the palace's delicate balance. At precisely 2:14 a.m., under the weight of silence and secrecy, Prince Edward accessed the lesser-known Balmoral East Wing archive using the Queen's obsidian key. What he found would shake the monarchy to its core: several velvet pouches containing handwritten directives, each bearing the Queen's crest and Catherine's name. The monarch's true will hidden from the world. The moment Edward turned the final lock, he knew he had crossed a line. Not just a line of protocol, but one that could unravel the very scaffolding of royal succession. For years he had battled Camilla's grip over the historical record, her influence suffocating access to the very documents that shaped royal destiny. While she cloaked her authority in tradition, Edward knew the truth was buried in ink, his mother's ink. Elizabeth's archive wasn't simply an organized vault, it was a fortified system, coded and obscured, entrusted only to a chosen few. The obsidian key wasn't ceremonial, it was sacred, and its use signaled not curiosity but confrontation. Inside, the pouches were pristine, untouched by time or tampering. Each one bore the seal of a monarch whose silence had been deliberate, whose foresight had been quietly sharpened in her final years. Within the first pouch, Edward uncovered what the public was never meant to see: a second codicil to Elizabeth's already enigmatic succession letter. This version made no reference to Camilla. No elevation, no ambiguity. Instead, it positioned Catherine, not just as William's consort, but as the structural safeguard in the event of constitutional deviation. That phrase, so cold, so calculated, implied Elizabeth had feared far more than a transitional error. She had anticipated a storm. And it wasn't just that one letter. There were margins scribbled with notes her own handwriting praising Catherine's constitutional instinct, her deliberate neutrality in domestic fray, and her intuitive alignment with the crown's symbolic centre. Edward's hands trembled not from shock, but from confirmation. He wasn't speculating anymore. He was witnessing the quiet blueprint of a monarch whose public restraint had been matched only by her private resolve. Then came the most unexpected revelation, an annotated journal entry referencing a council Edward had never heard of Clarion, not a ceremonial gathering, a true, hidden advisory body, formed outside traditional structures. Its purpose, to prepare for the unimaginable. He sat in silence for a long time after that. The documents were a cathedral of intent, but within them was a dilemma that cut deeper than any rivalry. If he made this public, it wouldn't just unseat Camilla, it would ignite every buried resentment, every unresolved whisper about the crown's trajectory since Elizabeth's passing. But if he withheld it, the monarchy would continue as a house built on omission. In that moment, Edward realized the weight of the pages wasn't in their paper. It was in their power to rupture or restore the royal line. But as Edward prepared to reveal the truth, a far more dangerous force moved to intercept him, one deeply entrenched in decades of royal manipulation. Behind Buckingham's gilded facade, a power block had long maneuvered to keep Camilla's presence uncontested. Known among insiders as the House of Obstruction, this inner circle had suppressed archival releases, rewritten ceremonial records, and even intercepted internal briefings. And now Prince Edward had crossed their line. For years, this shadow entity operated with surgical precision, concealing the monarchy's deepest fractures beneath polished protocol. Composed of unnamed senior courtiers, legal architects loyal to Camilla, and stewards of classified royal information, the obstruction's influence extended beyond policy. It was cultural, generational. Every document delayed, every file redacted, every briefing reshaped, it all flowed through their careful web. They weren't preserving the monarchy, they were controlling its narrative, and Edward's discovery of Elizabeth's sealed succession directive was, in their eyes, not just dangerous, it was a declaration of war. Within hours of his access being recorded, internal security was reactivated around the Balmoral East Wing. And a formal emergency destruction order was drafted, citing potential constitutional contamination. But it was more than panic. It was preemptive erasure. Edward, long underestimated within royal hierarchy, chose confrontation over concealment. His first move was deliberate. He confronted Lord Aldridge, keeper of the Royal Vault Ledger, face to face, forcing a verbal acknowledgement that the Queen's Appendix Windsor IV had been excluded from the central record with full awareness. The confrontation, sharp and unrelenting, rippled across corridors, typically shielded from such intensity. Aldridge, a man once considered untouchable within institutional circles, faltered. For the first time, silence broke. The ledger had been falsified, deliberately. Under orders Edward suspected traced back to Camilla's legal counsel, and still, no public move was made. The palace remained quiet, its exterior composed, while within fractures began to widen. Yet Edward wasn't alone in the dark. Princess Anne, ever composed but fiercely principled, extended her silent support. Her endorsement was discreet, off-record, untraceable, but it was enough to keep Edward standing. She knew what it meant to sacrifice legacy for truth, and this time she wasn't willing to watch history bend again. Anne didn't speak at briefings or release statements. She simply ensured that Edward's access was not revoked. That alone sent a message few dared interpret aloud. Still, Catherine remained untouched by the storm, shielded, not by design, but by a deliberate effort from those who believed she needed to remain unaware until the moment was right. Edward wasn't just protecting her, he was preparing her. The House of Obstruction, sensing that control was slipping, doubled down. Leaks were threatened. Narratives were crafted in advance. Even whispers about Edward's mental strain began surfacing. Old tactics, meant to erode credibility before the truth could rise. But Edward had prepared for that too. Because this wasn't the first time he had come across fragments of Elizabeth's secret planning. Nearly 2 decades ago, she had entrusted him with something else, something he had kept hidden, even from himself. A royal decree sealed in escrow, bound by time, and untouched until the storm came. And now, it was time to open it. But even as the obstruction moved to silence him, Edward played his next card. A secret royal decree held in escrow, untouched for nearly 2 decades. Hidden beneath layers of wax, cloth, and coded script, the proclamation was dated March 19, 2004, written in Elizabeth's own hand. It detailed a formal but unratified succession path in the event of royal constitutional collapse. At the heart of it, a name no one expected to see until her coronation, Catherine Middleton. The parchment trembled in Edward's grip, not from age, but from the force of its implications. The ink had barely faded. The Queen's distinct, deliberate handwriting bore none of the ambiguity that plagued public declarations. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a sovereign safeguard. Crafted just weeks after Prince William had confided in his grandmother about his intention to propose, the document revealed a monarch not waiting for events to unfold, but bracing for consequences she saw coming. Elizabeth, ever the stoic strategist, had embedded within the folds of tradition a contingency, plan too daring to ever speak aloud. The term lineal spiritus, obscure to most, but weighty to those who understood royal doctrine, appeared 3 times in the document. A concept that combined spiritual legitimacy with constitutional necessity. The message was clear: if the crown's line was ever compromised, the spirit of the monarchy must prevail, not merely the bloodline. Edward read it in full silence, then and again, each time sinking deeper into the meaning behind his mother's intent. The prose was regal, but unmistakably disillusioned. Hidden between the ceremonial phrasing was a tone of frustration, weariness. Elizabeth spoke of influences around the Prince of Wales whose loyalties were not to crown or country, but to preservation of power. It was a haunting indictment. And then, a chilling echo of the past, the structure of the proclamation mirrored that of George VI's secret wartime provisions, intended only to be activated if the monarchy was ever at risk of collapse. This wasn't a backup. It was a quiet revolution waiting for the right storm. In the most striking clause, she wrote, "The crown shall rest where the people find their heart." 16 words, a declaration that bypassed hierarchy and political fear, anchoring the monarchy not in protocol but in emotional truth. And there, unblinking, was Catherine's name, anointed not by title, but by trust. It was not symbolic. It was sovereign. Edward, a man rarely shaken by ceremony, found himself unable to speak as he reached the final lines. He had read decades of royal documentation. None had ever ended like this. Elizabeth didn't sign it with her title. She signed it as Lilibet, guardian of the flame. Edward folded the document with trembling hands, and for the first time, he understood that what he held was more than a proclamation, it was a reckoning. But while the Queen's words rang with clarity, what followed was chaos, a race against time, to authenticate, protect, and prepare for inevitable backlash. For years, Catherine had walked beside destiny, unaware that Elizabeth had quietly sculpted her future behind velvet curtains. Every private lunch, each whispered word, was not just mentorship, it was anointing. Now, fragments of those moments returned with brutal clarity, and Catherine began to feel the weight of something larger than monarchy. It started with a voice, Elizabeth's, soft but commanding, captured in private recordings once catalogued under ceremonial archives, now played in a locked room where Catherine sat alone. The conversations weren't ordinary. They were deliberate, often cryptic, and always focused on matters beyond fashion or duty. Elizabeth had asked about loyalty, about sacrifice, about ruling not with the scepter, but with silence and strength. She had asked Catherine if she believed the public trusted instinct over inheritance. At the time, Catherine hadn't understood. Now she couldn't escape it. Every word from the late Queen now felt like a puzzle piece designed for a crown no one had told her she was being measured for. Then came the prayer book, It had been handed to Catherine in 2011, Queen Mary's private devotional, passed down quietly, without fanfare. At the time, it was dismissed by the press as a symbolic gesture. But now, with the archives open and the truth clawing its way into daylight, the significance cut deeper. That book had only ever been passed to future reigning women. Staff interviews unearthed during Edward's archival push revealed a term repeatedly used behind closed doors: scenario rehearsals. Quiet simulations, crafted by Elizabeth herself, where she asked Catherine how she might respond if the public turned, if the crown fractured, if she stood alone. None of it was explained. All of it was preparation. In Catherine's own journals, which she revisited with a tremor of disbelief, were confused reflections from those years. She'd written about how Elizabeth asked strange questions during walks at Balmoral, how she'd mentioned Winston Churchill and Queen Victoria in casual comparisons, and how she'd once told Catherine, "Your restraint will be your reign." At the time, Catherine had thought it a compliment. Now she saw, for what it truly was, a warning. Princess Anne, now no longer on the sidelines, approached Catherine in private. With steady resolve, Anne broke the silence that had wrapped the palace for decades. She began sharing briefings, timelines, and the network of sealed records that had always been hidden beneath layers of pageantry. Catherine didn't flinch. She listened, she learned, and for the first time she realized her story had never been one of accident. It had been architecture. Elizabeth hadn't chosen Catherine for her image. She had chosen her for her silence, for her judgment, for her ability to endure. What once felt coincidental now felt scripted. The visits, the questions, the trust. And as Catherine sat with this unbearable truth, knowing the woman she loved as a grandmother had quietly shaped her as a sovereign, her world tilted. Not in fear, but in revelation. The monarchy hadn't turned to her suddenly. It had always been turning toward her. But as Catherine wrestled with this revelation, another force emerged, one determined to discredit everything before the public ever laid eyes on the truth. The palace hadn't seen such fury since the fallout of Diana's tapes. Camilla, upon learning of Edward's actions, activated every channel: press, legal, institutional. Her mission: destroy the archive's credibility before it became Catherine's coronation key. What followed was a brutal tug-of-war over history itself. Camilla's reaction was immediate and merciless. Within hours of Edward's findings making their way through palace corridors, she convened an emergency strategy session inside Clarence House, calling upon a circle of trusted legal architects who had, for decades, shaped the monarchy's public facade. The directive was clear: discredit, disqualify, dismantle. The documents retrieved by Edward were labelled romanticized dramatizations, the language of despair. Rate revisionists rather than sovereign decree. Leaks followed, timed, calibrated, weaponized. Former aides under instruction began speaking to select media outlets, peddling the notion that the Queen had suffered from archival delusion in her later years, subtly questioning her mental acuity without ever naming it directly. The smear was sophisticated, and it was working. Headlines erupted across the tabloids. Monarch's myth? Catherine coup sparks palace panic. Edward's descent into obsession. Suddenly, the public no longer saw a prince defending legacy. They saw a man accused of manipulating history to serve a personal agenda. Camilla's faction even surfaced an obscure royal policy, the Royal Seal Confidentiality Protocol, claiming Edward had violated its strict terms by exposing a document not formally ratified by the Privy Seal. Calls for disciplinary review circulated quietly among internal committees. Camilla had thrown the monarchy into a civil Cold War, one where perception was the battlefield and memory the casualty. But the public wasn't passive. Social media ignited in ways no royal strategist could control. Hashtags like #CrownClarified and #Elizabeth chose her trended globally. People weren't debating fact, they were reclaiming faith. Footage of Catherine beside the Queen, long dismissed as ceremonial, now pulsed with new meaning. The divide sharpened, and in the eye of the storm stood William. His silence had been strategic, but when Catherine became the target, that silence broke. In a rare breach of royal neutrality, William issued a private memorandum to palace legal staff denouncing the smear campaign, defending Edward's right to access and reveal historical truth, and, in unmistakable words, condemning the manipulation of Elizabeth's legacy for political gain. Camilla's allies were stunned. Their grip on the narrative had just been shattered by the one voice they could not afford to oppose. Behind closed doors, William confronted Camilla not in public, not with press, but with purpose. The rift between them was no longer private. He demanded a halt to all anonymous briefings and threatened formal withdrawal from joint appearances should the campaign against Catherine continue. It wasn't a threat, it was a fracture. The monarchy, still reeling from Elizabeth's absence, now found itself balancing on a knife edge between two futures, one built on truth, the other on fear. And yet, in the middle of this firestorm, Edward stood calm, because while Camilla's forces twisted paper into propaganda, he held something she couldn't refute. But even as the firestorm raged, Edward unveiled his final ace, a hidden video recorded in Elizabeth's final weeks, never meant to surface. It was her voice, frail, dignified, and unshakably firm. In a previously unreleased recording, Queen Elizabeth spoke with haunting clarity about the future she hoped for. "The crown must return to the people's heart," she said, "and I see that heart in Catherine. Once heard, nothing could be the same again." The footage was short, just under 11 minutes, but it carried the emotional weight of a sovereign reckoning with her final days. Recorded 8 weeks before her last public appearance, the Queen sat not as monarch, but as a woman confronting the fragility of the institution she had served for over 70 years. With eyes weary yet lucid, she spoke of legacy not in terms of lineage, but in terms of love, restraint, and resilience. She didn't name Charles directly, but her words left little to interpretation. "A reign of tradition may now require a spirit beyond inheritance," she said. "It is not the crown of gold that sustains a nation, it is the one who wears it with silence, strength, and grace." And then, with chilling precision, she declared what no protocol had ever permitted, that Catherine possessed a compassionate command that the monarchy could not afford to lose. Edward had been entrusted with the video under a rare codex protocol, one used only twice before in royal history. Buried in a private vault within the Windsor estate, it was labelled in the Queen's hand as for the restoration of truth. He had debated its release for weeks, fearing the seismic fracture it might cause. But after the campaign to bury the archives and the coordinated attempt to humiliate Catherine, he knew the time had come. The footage was not edited, it was not dramatized, it was raw, unscripted, and absolute. And once it was seen, the palace's grip on the narrative began to unravel at once. Within hours of its leak, the reaction was global. The public did not react with speculation, they reacted with fury, grief, vindication. Headlines across continents echoed the same sentiment. The Queen had chosen, and her choice had been silenced. Inheritance of spirit, not simply blood, became the rallying cry of a generation disillusioned by formality and hungry for sincerity. Hashtags turned into marches, royal watchers turned into activists, constitutional experts, once mute, now demanded hearings. The footage didn't just clarify a legacy, it ignited a movement. Charles remained silent, Camilla retreated, even senior courtiers once loyal to the mechanisms of concealment privately admitted to being shaken. Because the voice that echoed wasn't political, it was maternal, it was eternal, it was Elizabeth, stripped of pretense, pleading not for obedience, but for honesty. In her final act, she didn't crown Catherine with jewels, she crowned her with truth. But amidst the uproar, the monarchy had to make a choice, rewrite its own succession map, or continue a lie forged in silence. In a thunderous emergency session inside the Blue Room, the Royal High Council gathered, summoned by Edward, endorsed by Anne, and reluctantly attended by Charles. The agenda: a single, world-shattering vote whether to ratify the Queen's hidden succession decree and recognise Catherine as the intended successor. It was the first time in modern history that the High Council had been invoked under the Emergency Sovereignty Clause. The composition of the chamber was symbolic in itself: 12 members, each representing a distinct pillar of the crown: legal, constitutional, ecclesiastical, military, and royal blood. Normally, The council moved as one, bound by centuries of tradition and layers of caution. But on this day, the air was scorched by division. Edward took his place with the proclamation clutched tightly in hand. Lord Chancellor Beck, a staunch guardian of convention, immediately challenged the decree's legitimacy, calling it an emotional artifact, not a constitutional instrument. What followed was not debate, it was battle. Edward fired back with precedent. Historical declarations from George VI and Victoria that bypassed Privy Council approval in wartime crises. He invoked the Queen's recorded testimony, the sealed vault codex, and the testimony of palace staff who had borne silent witness to Elizabeth's intentions. Still, the Chancellor refused to yield. And then Anne stood, not with notes, not with formality, but with certainty. Her voice cracked as she described her mother's last days, her clarity of mind, her exact phrasing, and the moment she pressed Catherine's hand and said, "One day, this flame will be yours to carry." The room fell silent. It was no longer a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. Charles remained seated, pale, still. He had not spoken a word. Torn between duty and desire, he was trapped in a legacy he could not bend to his will. Camilla was nowhere in sight, her absence heavier than presence. The room turned next to Beatrice and Eugenie, once presumed neutral, if not sympathetic to Camilla. But in a stunning break, both women voted in favor of the ratification. Beatrice spoke of her grandmother's unparalleled foresight, and Eugenie, voice quivering, said simply, "She gave us Catherine before we knew we needed her." The vote came next. It was not unanimous, but it was final. 7 in favor, 5 against. The ratification passed. Within minutes, the news broke across every major outlet. Queen Elizabeth's secret successor confirmed. Crowds began to gather outside palace gates. Global commentators rushed to interpret what had just happened. It was a constitutional earthquake, but the crown stood redefined not by accident, but by intention. The monarchy had, for the first time in living memory, chosen spirit over structure. Edward closed the council with the words Elizabeth had penned nearly 2 decades earlier, "Let not the bloodline reign when the people's heart beats elsewhere." The room emptied, but the futu had already been decided. But the final act was not legislative. It was ceremonial. And it was Catherine herself who would decide how this story would end. She walked not with a crown, but with history behind her. In a private chamber lined with portraits of queens past, Catherine received Elizabeth's signet ring retrieved from the archive that nearly disappeared forever. It was not a coronation of jewels, but of justice. A quiet, powerful affirmation that destiny had been restored. No trumpet announced her entrance, no crowd roared. The moment was sealed not by spectacle, but by truth. It was Queen Victoria's private chamber, chosen not by tradition, but by memory, where Anne, Edward and William stood as silent witnesses. Each bore their own weight in that room, but none heavier than Catherine, whose hands now held a legacy once buried beneath decades of silence. As the ring slid onto her finger, there were no declarations, no proclamations. There was only presence. The transfer of Elizabeth's will unspoken, unwavering, irreversible. It was in this silence that the crown found its voice again. Charles did not attend, but hours later, a formal acknowledgement was issued from Buckingham. It bore his signature, his seal, and nothing else. No speech, no ceremony. Just the quiet confirmation that the succession ratified in the Blue Room had now been ceremonially fulfilled. His silence spoke more than words ever could. The monarchy had turned its page and he had accepted it. Whether with grace or resignation, only time would tell. But Catherine's path no longer waited for approval. In a private vow recorded after the ceremony, Catherine's voice was clear, calm and resolute. "I will rule with the people's voice," she said, "and if ever I forget the cost of silence, may this ring remind me." The footage was never broadcast. It was archived, secured, and stored in the newly expanded Royal Public Trust established by Edward to protect all documents surrounding Elizabeth's true succession. The National Gallery unveiled a dedicated installation, displaying the original codicil, the sealed video transcript, and personal letters from the Queen to Catherine, now protected by law and immune from future suppression. The truth had not only survived, it had been enshrined. Meanwhile, the House of Obstruction, once so embedded in the Crown's daily workings, faded into quiet dissolution. Titles were returned, appointments were rescinded, influence once wielded in the shadows disappeared without resistance. No formal investigation followed. There was no need. Their power had been tethered to secrecy, and secrecy had been buried beneath the ring Catherine now wore. The public, too, responded not with indifference but with awe. For the first time in decades, the Crown felt human again. Headlines around the world read not Queen, but People's Monarch. A phrase Elizabeth had once whispered in a rare moment of candor, and now it lived on the lips of millions. Catherine's reign did not begin with a coronation. It began with restoration. Of truth, of trust, of lineage guided by legacy, not ego. And as Britain looked to the future, it did so with clarity, conviction, and a crown returned to its rightful flame. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.